What's up, APUSH World? We have Chapter 40 of the 13th edition of the American Pageant, titled The Resurgence of Conservatism. We are almost done. The exam is near, and you are going to do amazing. Make sure you check out all my videos on the American Pageant. Also, if you want the PowerPoint used in any of these videos, follow the link in the description below. But let's get going with Chapter 40. So, starts off with the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980. Well, Reagan was a member of something called the New Right. What does this mean? Well, he believed that large government was a failure. So this big government, especially from the 1960s under Lyndon B. Johnson, he was a critic of. He advocated free markets and anti-Soviet foreign policy, and he was against government programs like welfare and food stamps. That was the heart of the Great Society. In the election of 1980, looking at this map, you could tell that he whoops the incumbent, Jimmy Carter. He destroys him pretty badly, winning many states. And Reagan won 489 to 49. So let's talk about something called the Reagan Revolution. Well, when Reagan becomes president on January 20th, 1981, Iran releases the hostages from the Iran hostage crisis. That happened under President Jimmy Carter's watch, and we covered that in the last chapter. Ronald Reagan famously said, "Government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem." He felt that big government was a problem. Government spending increased drastically between 1960 and 1980, and it definitely focused on entitlement programs during that time. So Reagan proposed a budget that would cut $35 billion from the budget. Reagan believed in something called supply-side economics, which was nicknamed Reaganomics, and this is tax cuts for the wealthy. And here is Ronald Reagan proposing his tax cut plan on national television. In theory, the rich would use this money to invest and spend money to improve the economy. So even though the government is cutting revenue for wealthy individuals, according to this theory, the government would make up this money by that money being reinvested in hiring more individuals. And you absolutely positively have to know this. This is very similar to Andrew Mellon's tax policies from the 1920s. Andrew Mellon was the Secretary of Treasury under Harding and Coolidge. So absolutely positively know that. Reagan advocated an increase in military spending, and throughout the 1980s, $2 trillion was spent on the Pentagon, and the Pentagon is the military. And this helps contribute to federal deficits. This is one of the ironies with Ronald Reagan. Even though he favored a smaller budget, he actually helped increase it due to spending on the military. So let's talk about the Cold War with Ronald Reagan. Why did Ronald Reagan increase military spending so much? Well, he believed that the Soviet Union could not compete with the high spending, and the Soviet leaders would then turn around and favor peace talks. He proposed something called the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, which is also known as Star Wars. Definitely be able to recognize that by both names. And this was Reagan's nuclear defense plan, and the belief is that these space stations in outer space could use lasers to defend against nuclear attack. So if the Soviet Union launches a nuclear missile to the United States, it would go into space, and these lasers in outer space would blow it up in the atmosphere. And this never occurred. Increased tensions throughout the 1980s with the Soviet Union were brought about for many reasons, including solidarity in Poland. This is a movement in Poland that comes full circle in 1989, in which they are trying to establish their own government. A Korean airliner was shot down by the Soviets when it inadvertently went into Soviet space. And also the Soviet Union boycotted the 1984 Olympic Games in Los Angeles in response to the U.S. boycotting the Summer Games in 1980 in the Soviet Union. All right, we're going to focus on some troubles abroad. The Sandinistas definitely know these individuals. These were anti-American revolutionaries in Nicaragua. Nicaragua is a country in Latin America. Reagan believed they were an extension of the Soviet Union, and he believed they would be the first of many Latin American countries to follow suit. So other countries would join in on this anti-American fervor in Latin America. So Reagan used covert aid in Latin America, and we'll talk more about the Iran-Contra affair. But Nicaragua, he sends aid to the Contras who are against the Sandinistas. Again, we'll talk about that more in a minute. And in El Salvador, he sent the military in to bolster the pro-American government. So he was not afraid to use the military in Latin America to further American gains. In the election of 1984, this is even more lopsided than the 1980 election. Ronald Reagan is up against Walter Mondale, and Walter Mondale chose a woman to be his vice president candidate, the first woman ever to run for the vice presidency. Reagan wins 525 to 13. In the 1980s, we see the emergence of Mikhail Gorbachev, aka Gorby, in the Soviet Union, and there he is. Poor Gorby, he's got a birthmark on his head and he's bald. He can't even cover it with his hair, the poor guy. He instituted two policies in the Soviet Union. One was glasnost, which means openness, and this allowed for some freedoms for Soviet citizens. And the other was perestroika, or economic restructuring to improve the Soviet economy. These two things inadvertently helped contribute to the fall of the Soviet Union. So he gives the citizens a little bit of freedom, and once they get that taste of freedom, they just want more and more and more, and the wheels are set into motion. The Soviet Union throughout the 1980s could not keep pace spending with the United States, as Reagan predicted. And Reagan and Gorby, they get together and sign some treaties limiting weapons, particularly nuclear weapons. Look at them. They're just smiling. They're having a good time. Two pals in front of a fire signing peace treaties. What's better than that? All right, let's go back to the Iran-Contra Affair. So what the heck does Iran and Nicaragua have to do with each other? Well, let's break this down. American hostages were held in Lebanon. There were several of them held in the Middle Eastern country of Lebanon. Contra rebels were fighting the Sandinistas. Again, the Sandinistas were the anti-American revolutionaries in Nicaragua. So let's see what these two have to do with each other. Well, the Reagan administration sold weapons to the Contras to fight these Sandinistas who were anti-American. That money, instead of coming to the United States, was then funneled over to Iran. And why are they giving it to Iran? Because they're hoping that Iran would help free these hostages. They would use their influence with Lebanon to have these hostages released. So it sounds like an okay thing. Why is this a problem? Well, Congress forbid providing aid to the Contras. They passed a resolution that did not allow the United States to help out in any way the Contras. So this is a direct violation of that. And Reagan also stated several times that he refused to negotiate with terrorists. So not only is he providing aid to the Contras, which is banned, he is also negotiating with terrorists, which goes back on something that he publicly said. So what are the effects of this scandal? Reagan claimed he was innocent, but this does tar his administration. There were high-ranking officials that were involved in this, but Reagan claimed all along that he was innocent. So let's talk about his economic legacy. He did not balance the budget, and one of the reasons why was because of this drastic increase in military spending. Spending on social programs was also reduced, so he reduced the spending on butter and increased the spending on guns, if you will. Let's talk about the emergence of the religious right in the 1980s. We have the Moral Majority, which is led by Reverend Jerry Falwell. And in the book, the 13th edition on page 977, it says that he's against sexual permissiveness, abortion, feminism, and the spread of gay rights. And this really appeals to many Americans living in the 1980s. The 1980s saw an increase in the right to life movement, or the anti-abortion movement, as well. So when we're talking about the court system, we see a rise in conservatism in the courts. Sandra Day O'Connor, here she is. She was the first woman named to the Supreme Court. She was appointed by Ronald Reagan. The court reversed some affirmative action gains from previous decades, most notably in the 60s. And Webster versus Reproductive Health Services was a Supreme Court case that placed some restrictions on abortion. In 1988, we have a referendum on Reaganism in which his VP, George H.W. Bush, runs for president. But before we get to that, in 1987, we have Black Monday, which is one of the worst days ever for the stock market. The Dow Jones dropped over 500 points, which was a lot for that time, but more importantly, it was 22%. So 22% of the value was lost in one day. In the election of 1988, you have Bush, again the vice president, versus Michael Dukakis, and you see that Bush won many, many states. He actually won the electoral vote of 426 to 111. All right, let's talk about the end of the Cold War. It happens during the first George Bush's administration. In 1989, we have the Tiananmen Square Massacre. 1989 is also a very important year for the Cold War. We have the Solidarity movement in Poland, which finally topples the Polish communist government. We have the fall of the Berlin Wall, which was kind of put into place during Reagan's administration when he famously said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." And Germany was reunited in 1990 into one country, so they're no longer as West and East Germany. The end of the Cold War saw cuts to the defense industry under Bush's watch. But we do have a crisis in the Persian Gulf, and here's a very interesting picture. This is Donald Rumsfeld over here shaking hands with Saddam Hussein. And this is interesting because Donald Rumsfeld was the second George W. Bush's Secretary of Defense, and he was a leading advocate of the overthrow of Saddam Hussein in 2003. And unfortunately for the United States in the 1980s, and really throughout history as well, they have kind of made friends with people that they would regret later on. But why is he shaking hands with Saddam Hussein? Because at this time they were providing aid to Iraq to limit the power of Iran. Iraq and Iran were fighting a war throughout the 1980s. So on August 2nd, 1990, Saddam Hussein and Iraq invaded Kuwait, and Kuwait is this little country to the south of Iraq. The U.S. and UN allies used advanced technology to crush Iraq beginning in January of 1991. It is a very short war. They use planes from the sky, and then they invade on the ground with troops, and Saddam ends up withdrawing from Kuwait. And before he leaves, he follows a scorched earth policy in which he burns a lot of oil fields in Kuwait. And George H.W. Bush gives a very famous speech when the war is over. He says, "By God, we've licked the Vietnam Syndrome once and for all." And what he meant by that was that the United States got into a war, they were successful, and it was not a long, drawn-out war like Vietnam. Bush on the home front, we see the passage of the American with Disabilities Act, or the ADA, and this prohibited discrimination against individuals with physical and or mental disabilities. He also appointed this man to the Supreme Court, Clarence Thomas, who was a conservative Supreme Court justice, and he was confirmed by a very close vote of 52 to 48. Pro-choice women began voting Democratic in the 1990s, and Bush campaigned in 1988 by saying this very famous quote, "Read my lips, no new taxes." And that was a pledge that he told Americans that he would not raise taxes. I bet he wishes he could get that one back, because he does raise taxes. Too soon, bro. Too soon. So a quick review. We have the Iran hostage crisis ends on Reagan's watch. Supply side economics, or Reaganomics, favored the tax cuts for the wealthy. Star Wars was Reagan's idea to shoot down nuclear missiles that may be launched by the Soviet Union. Gorby played an instrumental role in working with Reagan and helping contribute to the end of the Cold War. The Iran-Contra scandal, definitely know that. The affair, definitely know that, and its impacts on the Reagan administration. And also the Persian Gulf War happens during George H.W. Bush's watch, and it is a success for the United States. All right, that's everything you need to know about Chapter 40. Thank you very much for watching. If you have not already, please take a moment and subscribe to my channel. Help me spread the word. If you found this video helpful, please hit the like button. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them in the section below. I thank you very much for watching, and have a good day, guys.